All right, this is World Solution Writing Process. It's been a long break. First video since March 26. Wow, that means I've gone more than a month. So maybe a month and a half. I had a huge move. I moved. I had to. It was a wild situation. So now I have moved. The move is complete. Well, I still have a bunch of stuff in boxes, but whatever. I live in a new place now. That's the point. I'm set up here with my necessities, and I can get back to working on the book. So, previous episodes have been about things like specific topics, and I've read some random notes, but I've also read some stuff that's structured to introduce the chapter concepts to you of this book I'm writing. This is my writing process. Anyway, this episode is going to be very different. So I'm writing this book in not perfect conditions. And I write in this very stream of consciousness manner. And then I organize the stream of consciousness notes into chapters. And then I put those chapters into a coherent sequence and unity. But that's not how the text is yet, at least not some of it. So I got to process that scrambly text, that kind of random text. This is my writing process. And in the previous episodes, I did some of that. But I kind of also pre-wrote those episodes for you. No more of that. You're getting the raw stream. You're getting the writing process. So, to jump right to that, the way this works is I have small fragments that are going to get assigned to various chapters. And I will mention at the beginning of each fragment what chapter they're getting assigned to. And then I'll tell you the fragment of text that I wrote for that chapter. All right, so my process is I write with my hands in these paper composition books, real writing with my hand and a pen. Because it just flows out of me. It's almost like I can't stop it. And then I got to organize that. So I type it into a document, but in the original written form, it's all out of order. And then after I type it in to a first document called Composition Book Notes, then I copy and paste each fragment into its correct chapter section. So that's my flow. That's how I organize this thing. That's how I'm moving from chaos to order. This is how I fight the chaos demons, like the Warhammer Emperor. Anyway, so now that I told you what's going on, you'll be maybe less confused by the subsequent stream of nonsense that spews out of my mouth, and it's about to start. So I have a chapter called West and the Rest, which is about geopolitics. So I'll just read the fragment. Modern nuclear weapons might be an unstable element in international competition, but they also function as blackmail by the whole global ruling class against the whole global population. If we rise up, they can destroy the world at any time. But we have no choice but to call their bluff and rise up anyway. Perhaps they would try to sabotage a socialist world by unleashing the nukes, but we can rebuild on a basis of equality. End fragment. New fragment. For the section, Capitalism is Bad, I figure there should be a chapter for people who aren't already elite, vanguard, socialist, Sith Lords, like myself and probably you, the listener, for just people to be introduced to the idea that capitalism is bad. And not just evil, it is evil, yes. But also that it's bad, it just doesn't work very well. It's a machine that works badly. So, the fragment for that section. Fiat currency is an abstraction of GDP instead of gold, so still has a material basis, which is why it can be subject to inflation. I have a section on revolutionary history, where I just cover a lot of events, try to organize the raw chronology into the big major chunks of the eras of revolutionary history. So instead of history just all being a spaghetti mess in people's brains, it's organized into good, distinct eras. Those 4 eras would be Reformation, Enlightenment, Socialist revolutions, and post-socialist revolutions of the democracy, color revolutions, and Arab Spring. And of course you have the anti-colonial movement going on throughout all of that in parallel, simultaneous. So, history section. Maybe I might cover France in 1917 a bit. In 1831, there was some kind of revolt in France. These are just notes to myself for the history section. I'll get back and research those topics in more depth later, so you're not left hanging. Anyway, next fragment. West and the Rest. Europe is both an empire and a victim of imperialism, of course United States imperialism. And the only way for Europe to achieve independence from America is through socialist revolutions. Another fragment for the geopolitics section. In the fight between capitalist democracy and authoritarian mixed economies, we have no dog in that fight. But in a conflict between capitalist democracy and capitalist dictatorship, the choice should be clear. So, on the one hand, you have regimes like Iran, Belarus, and China, Cuba, Vietnam. And then you have other regimes like Russia and Syria, which are way more privatized, and they're on the chopping block. A fragment for the section, Main veins of Marxism. The fragment is simply the 4 words, anarchy isn't punk enough. Next fragment. There's a section called Why Regime Change, a chapter. The fragment says, even a European social democratic welfare capitalist country cannot fully or even partially socialize its economy without a change of government, in other words, a revolution. End fragment. Next fragment. A lot of geopolitics. More of that. What may occur is a third Cold War, in which socialist revolutions take over North America and Western Europe, and the West then wages a global geopolitical struggle against the remaining capitalist world. Of course, the West becoming socialist would be a fundamental shift in global power dynamics, a massive ideological transformation, probably the largest and most revolutionary historic event ever. We must dare to imagine it, because the fate of humanity depends on our doing so. End fragment. So this is just my stream of consciousness writing process. This is the notes I jot into my notebook and then type into my computer. So random stuff is mixed in here. I won't read all of it, but okay, like here's lines from my comedy routine that I haven't organized into a routine yet, but are just lines. If comedy doesn't hit you over the head with the internecine debates of competing anti-capitalist ideologies, it's boring, it's not funny, and it's not comedy. My routine may be about being a space emperor, but it's also about being an American millennial Marxist, which is more bizarre and intense than being a space emperor, and is the reason I had to become one. Next fragment, the section on revolutionary dictatorship. I merely note that it may at some point be necessary to pursue something called a socialist directorate. If a legislature doesn't work out, retreat to the executive form. Anyway, next fragment. For the chapter titled Parallel Government, this fragment says, parallel government is the heart of dual power. More for the parallel government section. Parallel government may emerge by the defection of one governing body against the ruling order, such as the various formerly monarchist legislatures turning against the kings in the English and French revolutions. In the section titled National Refoundation, I say that I must cover the topic, a note to myself, of Evans Carlson, the communist sympathizing United States Marine. That's a trippy story, and worth putting in the section specifically dedicated to the United States called National Refoundation, but also to the national question globally. For the section Multi-Party Socialism, a fragment that says, while on the one hand our goal should be to reveal and overcome the falsity of Western democracy under capitalism, on the other hand we should also seek to preserve the real and material benefits of pluralism and individual rights under Western democracy from the global trend toward creeping authoritarianism. And I think in an earlier fragment, I said something about how the West will have to become socialist to save democracy. For the main veins of Marxism section, a fragment, Cornelius Castoriadis, founder of Socialism or Barbarism group in France, serves as a link between Trotskyism, Third Campism, and the Situationists. Because the founder of the Situationists came out of the group that he started. Guy Debord came out of a group started by Cornelius Castoriadis. Next fragment, Why Regime Change fragment. Why regime change? There's no doubt reform struggles and reform demands have gotten us to this point of mass unrest. The issue is, now that we're here, the emphasis must shift from reform to revolution. We are not at the October stage, or even the July days stage, in which it yet makes sense to attempt to disband the capitalist governments. Instead, we are at the February stage, in which, simultaneous with a resurgence in the global democracy struggle, it now makes sense to form alternative legislatures against the capitalist legislatures and capitalist dictatorships. In the vein of the workers' councils formed in Russia in 1917, but since our revolutionary legislature will have to be intentional rather than falling into our hands spontaneously due to a struggle against the monarchy as in Russia, ours will take the form of a simple legislature rather than a workers' council federation. We should also keep in mind the role of revolutionary anti-capitalist ideology provided by both socialists and anarchists in contributing to an animating and agitating backbone, which has served as a common thread of ideas, activists, and organizers throughout the waves of protest from 1999 to the present, which has gotten us to this point of general unrest. Yeah, it's really important to point out, like, you had the World Trade Organization protests in 1999, and in many ways, the same people who mobilized around that were those in the anti-war movement from really roughly 2003 forward. And then a lot of those people ended up in Occupy Wall Street. Some of those ended up in Bernie Sanders. And Black Lives Matter is going on simultaneously parallel, even before Bernie, back in 2013, 2014. And then you had the anti-Trump protests, and then you had the BLM protests, and globally, price protests and anti-government protests emerging out of the price protests, revolutionary struggles. Now you've got Gaza. So there's been, like, the second half of my life has just been an era of protest. And it's been a lot of the same people in that thread. And that's just kind of what I wanted to point out. Next fragment for this section, Main Veins of Marx. Okay, this gets a little weird. There was a Facebook group called Embracing the Infantile, which is, I think, very influential, actually, despite its very humorous orientation. So I'll just read the fragment. Hopefully the fragment will explain everything. Embracing the Infantile partially got started from a different Facebook group called Aesthetics, Politics, Theory, Red and or Black, which became populated by members of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Platypus Affiliated Society supposedly began as a splinter from the Spartacist League, a Trotskyist group, a rabid Trotskyist group. Embracing the Infantile is significant because it combined ultra-leftist ideas which refused participation in all reform struggles such as left communism and nihilist communism, with an extremely influential online community of silly antics, as well as a sharp debate over class politics and identity politics, which resulted in a split of Embracing the Infantile into two separate groups, at least one of which is secret, its name therefore not being mentioned here. In the history section, there was a group called the Iko-Iki, a peasant populist Buddhist warrior monk resistance in Japan. And I just make a note to myself to include that in the revolutionary history section. Also kind of like a spiritual thing for me, but whatever. Anyway, Laftivism, which is a subsection of the non-violence chapter. What parallel governments and role-playing games have in common is a sort of inner transformation of people and groups of people, as they experiment with thinking of themselves in a different way. They can imagine being an orc or a wizard and a member of an adventuring party, and they can imagine being a member of a revolutionary legislature, even if in miniature at first. End fragment. New fragment. Nonviolence section. You can be a civilian and still be a revolutionary. Many of history's greatest revolutionaries were exactly this, including Martin Luther and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Robespierre and Lenin. A democratic socialist planetary republic. That goes in geopolitics. In the change of government section, to spell it out unmistakably. Disband the ruling legislature, disband US Congress, disband British Parliament, disband the Russian Federal Assembly, disband the Chinese National People's Congress, disband German Bundestag, disband the Japanese National Diet, disband the Italian Parliament, disband the French Parliament. They've got to go. And then I'm going to end on a note that might be a little bitter for some of you, and you might not agree with me. It's the chapter about class and identity left and right, in which I argue that we're going to have to overthrow capitalism to liberate all the oppressed identities, and I don't really think much other activity is helpful. In fact, I think it's counterproductive. Sort of like a Chinese finger trap. The harder you struggle, the worse it gets. But when you go against the grain, counterintuitively, then you're free. Anyway, fragment. Racial policing is an intrinsic emergent property of American capitalism. Next fragment. Same section. Same topic. The left lacks the power to win the revolution, but of critical importance, the left does possess the power to sabotage the revolution. So I'm part of this movement that thinks that socialism does not have to be part of leftism, and is better off not being part of leftism. I'll get into more of that in other fragments, where maybe I'll make an episode about it later, where I think that the new left is a competing tendency against Marxism. I think the new left is based on idealism, whereas Marxism is based on materialism, and that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. And I think the fate of the human species hinges on socialists deciding to prioritize economics and revolution, because if we insist on our leftist cultural preferences as a requirement to have a movement to overthrow capitalism, then what will happen is our movement will never succeed. That America is too conservative in many ways, culturally, and this is also just a problem with capitalism itself. This is a ruthless prioritization. It is basically a sacrifice we are going to have to make to prevent the collapse of the species, because capitalism is collapsing the human species fast, and we're going to have to sell socialism to the public in a way that doesn't clash with their cultural prejudices so much. I'm not saying we should do the MAGA communism thing where we embrace the right wing. I almost think of it as becoming centrist, whereas socialism may be centrist. Or maybe it's just not part of the left or the right. Maybe it's just its own independent movement. And that's my way of thinking, and it's a very different way of thinking than a lot of people. But if you're actually thinking about the country you live in, I'm thinking about America. I live in America. And I'm thinking how am I going to get Americans to do this? And it's not going to be through the culture war left. It's going to have to be through the whole people. And not necessarily the Trump supporters. I think they're so rabidly anti-communist. They're just going to kind of end up on the other side. But we do have to cut across partisan and demographic lines a little more powerfully. There's a lot of research about how among Generation Z there is a really intense gender divide on politics, where men are all the way to the right and women are all the way to the left. And a lot of it is because of the Me Too movement. And when you take away a person's right to have the human right to benefit of the doubt for the accused, and you say, oh, any man who defends himself is gaslighting, and any speech in defense of yourself is oppressive structural violence against women, then you've turned half the population into an anti-leftist demographic. We can't reverse that, but we can transcend it by choosing a political project and a political messaging that prioritizes the economic suffering of the people. In America, you have every 10 minutes, someone dies from lack of health care. Every 40 minutes, someone starves to death. It's not that I don't want to be in solidarity with XYZ oppressed identities. It's just that to seize the means of production, we kind of have to focus on seizing the means of production. And it is a different focus. And people, the left communist critique has really sharpened my understanding of how all these identity struggles suck you into reformism. But, they're not the only ones. Like the social democrats who focus on economic stuff, they do that too. The problem to me is that I don't think you can really significantly solve these oppressions. I mean, this final fragment, we'll really just take home that whole topic. It's the same chapter, same topic. The only real way to shift the culture in a permanently progressive direction at a deep level is by abolishing artificial scarcity. So I'll cover this more. It's probably the most painful debate on the left. It's deeply painful for me personally. I think it's painful for everyone. And, we want to think that we can do both, but I don't think we can. I think the idea that you can always do everything is idealism. And when you actually get into an organization and you have to select organizing priorities, you have people who say, oh, we got to do this and this and this. And you have like 10 different priorities, and then they all suffer. And you have to pick a few. You do have to focus in real life for real changes to occur. But furthermore, it just seems to me that we've gotten to a point where, for example, in the cities, women actually in some cases are now making more than men in the millennial age group. That's a big reversal. I think we've run up into the limit of what legislation can do. It seems to be the fixation is to constantly legislate issues of culture. And the problem is the culture is spontaneously reactionary because it's a culture that is socialized under capitalism. So you're going to end up legislating everything. And then there's going to be the natural hostility to that of people just hating the nanny state being up in every inch of their life. And you end up generating backlash by engaging in prioritizing or even, honestly, even including the culture war as a main focus or a major focus even. Indirectly is the best way to wage the struggle against identity oppression, which means you acknowledge and admit that it is real and it is true, that it exists. But you also have to contend with the fact that there's no real solution to it within capitalism, which a lot of people say is a cop-out until you realize, well, I'm not telling people to wait forever. I'm actually accelerating the struggle against capitalism as rapidly as humanly possible. Forming revolutionary governments over conference calls, this is real stuff. We're actually doing this piece by piece, bit by bit. And this means that maybe we've overshot the correct distance on the culture war. Also, there's many facets to this argument. One is that you can't really significantly improve culture beyond, what capitalism allows within the framework of capitalism. But there's also an argument that we've established legal equality. To expect to establish cultural equality through legislation is unrealistic. You can make people legally equal, but if you legally mandate that everyone has to go to these diversity trainings that they make people go to, well-intentioned, and I understand why you would want to send people to them, they end up actually backfiring. They end up turning people against inclusive thinking. So my ideology about how to approach this whole thing is if you're angry at identity oppression, and you should be, then you should work even harder to rapidly accelerate the downfall of global capitalism and in your own country, using the methods I've outlined elsewhere in the podcast. Get on it. But then also, we're in a strange moment where, in some cases, the shoe is now on the other foot. And what was previously called reverse racism or reverse sexism is now just racism and sexism. Because if millennial women are making more money, then there can be structural oppression against men. If immigration is driving down wages of people who live here, then that's globalization waging oppression against the working class. And yeah, I think working classes, to take state power, have to prioritize the interests of the working class in their country. But I think sometimes what immigration does is it ends up subverting the standard of living in the first world without really significantly solving the poverty and lack of development in the global south. But these are opinions that will get you labeled an evil class reductionist, a Nazbol, a red-brown, a Strasserite. And I reject all of those ideologies. I've studied them and they're not for me. I find them poisonous and horrible. Maybe a little bit of the class reductionist, but definitely rejecting the right-wing Strasserite, Nazbol, red-brown ideologies completely, like radically. In many ways, the writing of this book emerged out of this conflict over class and identity within the socialist movement. And I don't even want to say left, because I don't really think the left is my audience. I think the socialist movement is my audience. And the socialist movement is already big enough in the United States. If you just mean all the people who in opinion polls say they prefer socialism over capitalism, that's enough people to consider it a movement, and a very mass movement. If we just had all the people who say socialism in the opinion polls organized, like, we could take state power with them right now. But we don't have them organized in that way yet. Rambling, point being that I don't really think there's a way for the class first and class prioritizing side of the class identity or class versus culture debate to actually win, except by out-organizing the other side, out-organizing the people who are all obsessed with harm reduction and safe spaces and call-out culture. I don't think those people are helpful or productive. I think they are actively destroying the socialist movement from the inside. And there was an instance called the Congress on Cultural Freedom in the United States, was a CIA-sponsored meetup of artists and intellectuals and activists to use questions of culture war, to turn Americans against the Soviet Union and to call out the left against the Soviet Union. Let me look up what year this was. It was in 1950 in West Berlin. Even Wikipedia says it was supported by the Central Intelligence Agency. So this is a real thing. And they do use culture war to take the steam out of the class war. It's depressing because it's not like, identity oppression isn't real. Okay, say the situation between men and women. What if women are now making as much or more than men in certain age groups in certain places? That doesn't mean women aren't still struggling with reproductive rights. And that doesn't mean all women in all age groups are making more than men. Many are still making less. So you have a situation that I would say is more complicated than just classic, like, oh, men are on top, women are on the bottom. You have to be a hyper-feminist that supports every single thing that every woman says. No, I think we need something more like a gender-neutral movement that just values human rights for everyone. Kind of like the Cyborg Manifesto said. Just see everyone as an undifferentiated gray mass. Because in order to organize the whole people, you really do have to prioritize the rebellion of the entire populace on a class basis, rather than, dividing them up into these preferential sections. And it shouldn't be the case that when you focus on one group's oppression, that it alienates other groups, but it does. And so how are you going to organize a socialist rebellion on the basis of how people really are and how people really think, rather than how we would prefer them to? So, yeah, this ended up going beyond. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that the first time I did my random notes, it ended up being a class and identity exploration. But that's okay, because I've been sort of not dealing with this topic the whole time because it's the most controversial part of my book. Maybe other than this Western orientation of centering the socialist revolution globally in the Western world. But in many ways, this book exists because of that debate. And I don't think, like I said earlier, the class first tendency that takes this approach of prioritizing class over identity and class over culture, economics over culture, we're not going to win unless actually we just figure out how to win the revolution in general. So really it started in my mind with a question: how do I make the people who prioritize class over identity win out within the socialist movement? And the answer I found is the only way to do that is to win the revolution against capitalism itself. Because the false consciousness is so intense, the communication is so contentious and broken, that just trying to persuade the other side is at the point where, to me, it seems impossible. Like, communication is broken down, people are talking past each other, they don't want to hear each other. Kind of like the left and the right. I don't really think I'm capable of persuading Trump supporters of socialism. And I don't think I'm capable, or anyone is capable, eloquent or, intelligent as they may be, of convincing the people who are more like woke, social justice warrior type people to shift over and realize that they're digging their own grave with that stuff. No matter what I say, they're not going to get it. And the only way I can make them get it is by leading a socialist revolution using a more advanced strategy than any other strategy than currently exists. Which is why I'm all on this stuff about forming socialist parallel governments, starting anti-government protests against capitalist governments, and all of that. Well, this has ended up being a bit more harrowing because I don't really want to dive into this melee of class and identity just yet, but it seems I have. I don't know how people will respond. But point is, I have to talk about these things because this is my writing process and this book needs to be written, or else I fear the species may be doomed, etc. So here we are. This is the real me. Mask off. Yeah, I focus on all this really constructive stuff about revolutionary history, the structure of change of government, how to realign bureaucracies and security forces from capitalist governments to socialist governments. But I'm also one of those people who you might think of as a troll or a Red Brown or a Strasserite or a Nazbol, even though I reject all of that. I'm someone who thinks that it's not just that class or economics is more important than culture or identity. It's that I think the culture war and the identity war are actively sabotaging any possibility of a successful socialist revolution. And that's really the gauntlet that I'm throwing down, not because I just want to be contrarian or antagonistic. Quite the opposite. I wish I could just get along with everyone, but the situation does not allow me to. That's rough. You know, sometimes division is necessary, and you have to take a position where you swim against the stream, where you're in the minority, and everyone will say, you must be mad, you must be out of your mind because look how isolated you are within the movement on this question. But you might be the advanced element, the vanguard, that's telling people the things that they need to hear instead of the things that they want to hear. So maybe don't always go by popularity. In fact, I resist popularity at every step because I think that's true leadership. And it's not about being contrarian. It's about taking the positions that you think are the real positions and logistically and psychologically preparing for the waves of repression and counterattacks from within your own movement that will inevitably ensue. The waves of hostility, the waves of debate, the waves of expulsions, the waves of denunciations and slander, all of it will happen to you if you take this position, which is why you've got to if you're a real revolutionary. True punk, good trouble. Thank you for listening. This has been World Solution Writing Process. Random notes, unexpectedly turning into the question of class and identity and left and right. But I should have expected that. Signing off.